I'd like to ask Nimo or the panel, one of the panel, to answer that question, please.
Yeah. Actually, people are already doing a lot that they can do to combat global warming and to secure their survival. But the major challenge is that even when we talk about adaptation, it's patently unjust to force me to adapt to an increasing level of degradation being perpetuated by the same set of people, by the same nations, and the same polluting industry. So the reason why we are here, part of the reason we are here, is to stand together with the teeming voices outside, and also to speak to the delegations right here, that look, the level of impact that people are being confronted with is far beyond what individuals can handle. And so we need collective action from countries, especially direct emissions cut from rich polluting nations. And in Friends of the Earth International, we don't only mobilize just to resist. We are working with grassroots organizations and communities on real alternative actions to transform from what we are doing now to what can secure our future.
Thank you, Nimo. Any other questions from journalists? Okay, you can have one more question and then we'll close it. And please, if you want to speak to the guys afterwards, please feel free to do so. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, not about Mina, you answer. Do you want to say something before we move on?
No, on the question about why you need money. And I think I completely agree with Nimo. It's really beyond the capacity of the poor communities. I mean, the poor communities are struggling. And I was very struck by what the president of Chad did talk about. And it was very moving, actually, because he was talking about how the Lake Chad has already dried up. And it's supposed to support about 200 million people indirectly and a few million very directly. And he was saying that the poor people are the ones who resort to the natural resources, the forest, to get their fuel and the food and so on. So how do you expect the poor to say, stop, you're relying on these natural resources, or don't cut your trees? And I think this is the real problem, because the poor are really dependent on natural resources, and the poorest countries who do not commit to any emissions are suffering the impacts. Like, for instance, adaptation. In many developing countries, the biggest problem is adaptation, because the mitigation emissions reductions are not going down fast enough. So you have, like Bangkok, you have the entire city of Bangkok under floods, Pakistan under floods, massive hundreds and millions of people underwater. And these are the very same countries who struggle to feed people. And so to say that money is not important, it's really a problem. So I think this is why the Framework Convention was negotiated, recognizing that the historical polluters are responsible for providing the money and the resource for those who did not contribute to the pollution.
And if I may add, Friends of the Earth International works with people at grassroots, living next to oil wells, living next to oil refineries. These are people that live in shack settlements in South Africa that don't have access to energy and see the Eskom power lines go past them. In South Africa, 16% of the electricity is used by residents, and the rest is used by big business and industry. So there's a reality there of Friends of the Earth International challenging for energy equity. And what we are asking for as well as Friends of the Earth International, and we're pushing this in wherever we work internationally, is to recognize that we have to move beyond the fossil fuel agenda economy. And so you do hear quite often calls of keep the oil in the soil, keep the coal in the hole. And those are not unrealistic realities. Those are realities that are happening in the Niger Delta, where people are stopping the drilling of oil, in the Yasuni, in Ecuador, and in a variety of other places. People are looking for alternatives. Okay, having said that, thank you very much for attending, and if you need to speak to anybody afterwards, please feel free to come forward. Thank you. Mess up with the technology, so you know that.
We'll be starting the Climate Action Network press briefing in just a moment.
One more thing, upfront for people that need is the media briefing, as well as the spokespeople for Friends of the Earth International. Please come up front and take the necessary documents. Thank you.
Whichever you suggest.
In here, so you go ahead.
Were you putting where?
You, yeah.
I'm at the end, okay.
Yeah.
It's almost logical. We have a roadmap even if the parties don't, right?
Yes. It's fun.
Oh yeah, because the microphone has some problem now. We have the microphone working now, and we will ask them to speak to the microphone. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Bye. So, if the people you're giving the microphone to, and they already start speaking.
If I can ask everyone to take their seats, we're going to get started. Please take conversations outside if necessary. Welcome, everyone. This is the Climate Action Network. Okay, there we go. Okay, thank you. So as I said, this is the Climate Action Network International Press Briefing. We're a network of over 700 organizations in 95 countries around the world. My name is David Turnbull, by the way, and I'm the director of the Climate Action Network International. So as I said, we're the world's largest NGO network focusing on climate change. We've been following these negotiations for the past 20 plus years, since even before the UNFCCC was started. And so we're here together as a network at these negotiations in Durban to push for a progressive outcome out of this conference, and an ambitious one as well, of course. Just quickly on some logistical announcements, we'll be here every day at 12:30 giving press briefings like the one we'll be doing today. We also have an eco newsletter. This is a newsletter that we put out that is written by our members every morning, and so you can see those around the conference hall. We also will be putting on Fossil of the Day Awards. This is a ceremony where we'll be calling out some of the players that we view as being detrimental to the talks, taking actions that are not, in our view, progressive or otherwise helping the negotiations. Those will be at 6 p.m. in the building across the street at the Durban Exhibition Center at the Cannes International booth. We'll have press releases, the eco newsletters, and press releases from the Fossil of the Day Awards on our website at www.climatenetwork.org as well. And of course, you can always contact us directly from that website if you have any questions or needs to speak to anyone. So today we have a panel of 3 speakers. We'll be hearing from Tim Gore from Oxfam, then Tasneem Essop from WWF, and finally Alden Meyer from Union of Concerned Scientists. Tim.
Thanks, David. So there's a lot of talk here in Durban about this being the African COP, and I thought I might just remind everyone that it's not the first time that the climate negotiations have come to Africa. The first time was actually 10 years ago in Marrakesh in 2001. And then there was an important promise made by developed countries. They promised the least developed countries, the poorest, that they would meet their most urgent adaptation needs. And they set up a new fund called the Least Developed Countries Fund, and they promised to fill it with the money that LDCs needed. And 10 years on, that promise has, to all intents and purposes, been broken. And we've had a lost decade of investment in adaptation in poor countries, predominantly the LDCs are here in Africa. And 10 years on from this African COP, we can't afford history to repeat itself. So I'm going to talk about why the urgency is so great. Firstly, talking about 3 recent reports which have come out in the last weeks. The first is the report from the International Energy Agency that I'm sure many of you will have seen, which sent really a stark warning to the world that we have 5 years left to prevent irreversible climate change. 5 years. The reason is that if we continue to invest in carbon-intensive infrastructure, the lock-in effect means that it will be too late to get on a 2-degree, less than 2-degree pathway. The second key report recently was from UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, and they updated their study of the gap between the pledges of emission cuts currently on the table and what science says is needed by 2020 to stay below 2 degrees or the 1.5 degrees that's needed. And the story there was that the gap is getting wider. Despite the economic crisis, emissions are rising at an unprecedented rate. But they did also show that it's possible still to close that gap if we act urgently, and that's what we must do here in Durban. And the third report in recent weeks was from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who produced a special report showing that the links between climate change and extreme weather events like droughts and floods is becoming ever clearer. And I want to just talk, that's the science, and I just want to talk a bit about what the suffering from real people is behind that science, and nowhere clearer than here in Africa. In Africa, the impacts of climate change are felt predominantly through the food system, through the impacts on hunger. 75% of poor people in the world live in rural areas with their lives and livelihoods dependent in some way on agriculture. Just bear in mind that 95% of the agriculture on this continent is rain-fed, so highly vulnerable to changes in climatic conditions. We already have close to 1 billion people on the planet which go to bed hungry every night, Of them, 239 million people are in Africa. 239 million people in this continent already going hungry. And we can see the effects of extreme weather nowhere clearer at the moment than in the Horn of Africa with the terrible famine. 13 million people affected. In Kenya, we've had near total crop failure in some areas. In Ethiopia, 60% of cattle, 40% of sheep have died. That's totally devastating for the people whose livelihoods depend on livestock and on small-scale food production. And the bellwether of these types of impacts can often be food prices. And as a result of that drought in the Horn of Africa, we've seen sorghum, which is a key staple crop in the region, have increased nearly 400% over the 5-year average. Prices of maize increased between 150 and 200% over the 5-year average in those two countries. 150 and 200%. Now, for poor people, they spend up to 75% of their incomes on food. So if you get that kind of a food price spike, you can imagine just how devastating that is for your livelihood. And that's a story in Africa. It's repeated right now around the world. The floods that we've seen in recent weeks in East Asia have pushed up the rice price locally in Thailand and Vietnam by between 25 and 30% over last year. In Cambodia, the rice price has increased 19% in 1 month. And right now, a little known story at the moment, but there's a terrible food crisis that's striking in Afghanistan, where a drought earlier this summer, very consistent with climatic models which indicate that those types of droughts in the summer months will become more frequent and more severe in that part of Central Asia. That's already pushed up wheat prices in that country by 79%, and that's on top of the very high wheat prices from last year. So that gives you a sense of just how devastating climate change can be for the lives and livelihoods of poor people that are dependent on agriculture. Those are the extreme weather events that hit the headlines. Behind that, there is an insidious story of slow onset effects. Yields of crops are declining right now. Poor people don't know when best to plant their crops. And if we needed any more striking reminder of what this means, last night the floods and the heavy rains and flooding in this city in Durban, it's been reported that took 8 lives. So I think for negotiators meeting here in Durban, they could have no more stark a reminder of the urgency of dealing with this problem and the impacts on the lives of poor people, vulnerable people, if they do not. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. With that context in mind, we enter into this COP as one of the most unpredictable COPs, at least in my own experience. Everything seems to be fluid and everything's still in play. What we would like to see out of this COP is for parties to build on the progress already made, and specifically with regards to the progress made in Cancun. We need them to provide certainty about the kinds of actions and the level of actions that they will take to prevent disastrous climate change, and we've heard much about the impacts already happening. And we do want to get certainty about how binding those actions will be now and in the future. So certainly Durban has to lay the basis for all of that in these negotiations. What we see are key elements that require agreement and movement would be, firstly, of course, the issue of the legal mandate. So we do want to see parties agree, developed country parties agree to taking a second commitment period, and we would like to also see that all those parties not in the Kyoto Protocol agree to a mandate to negotiate a legally binding agreement by 2015 at least. Secondly, the issue of finance is a key issue for resolution. We would like to see the Green Climate Fund agreed to, and not just the fund being set up, but also be very clear about where the money will come from, where the money will flow from into that fund. We need parties to come here to acknowledge the gap that exists, both the gigaton gap, of course, and the unit report is a good indicator of that, as well as the finance gap that exists. And then we want them to close it. We certainly do not want parties in Durban to lock in the existing rules, the loopholes that weaken the levels of ambition that are already weak as it stands right now. And given that we are having this COP on the African continent, we know that the African priority would be getting security around support to deal with the impact of climate change. So setting up the adaptation committee becomes an important element of those agreements. But because this is such a fluid situation, we are presented with both opportunities to ramp up ambition, but we certainly do face a number of risks. So a few risks that we see that we need to guard against is the positioning now of parties looking at timelines to finalize a legally binding agreement. So the timeline that appears to be on the table is a 2020 timeline. We are also at risk of establishing a green climate fund. Even that is at risk, to be honest. But also, if we had the fund, we certainly could have a fund with no money. We are at risk of locking in existing bad rules, and so the land use rules and other loopholes that exist in the process can be locked in. And if we do that, we will certainly miss the opportunity of achieving the target that countries themselves had set in Cancun. So we won't be able to reach the target of limiting global warming below 2 degrees. And finally, we do run the risk of losing the Kyoto Protocol, the only rules-based system that we have. And what would be devastating is that the sum total of all of that could once again break down the trust that we have in the multilateral process, the only process that is inclusive and gives voice to the most vulnerable. So we come into this COP with all in play. This allows for the risks that I've spoken about, but also the opportunities that can exist for parties to, in fact, rise to the occasion. And the missing element, we believe, is political leadership. What I would like to conclude with is again to remind people that we are having this COP in South Africa, a country with an extremely painful but yet brave history. We have managed in this country to struggle against one of the most devastating systems against human rights and won. And we did that exactly because in the final hours we acknowledged that we could not go down the path of continued fighting, that we needed to talk and we needed to compromise. And it's in that spirit that we rise above, countries need to rise above their national interests, understand that what we're dealing with now is to protect the planet and its people. And what we need is compromise, the spirit of compromise in the interest of that global good. And so with that, we need to again be reminded everything is unpredictable, but our former president Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it is done.
Alden Meyer from Union of Concerned Scientists. Let me just build on that. I've been at 16 of the 17 COPs over the last couple of decades, and Tasneem is absolutely right. This is one of the most uncertain at the outset about what the outcome will be. I think we're approaching a clear fork in the road here. The question is, are we going to preserve and build on the legally binding regime that we've spent 14 years now creating since the Kyoto meeting in 1997? Project and expand on Kyoto, create a new legal instrument for the long term, launch a new process here that will give the world confidence that countries mean what they say and will rise to the challenge of increasing ambition to meet the science gap that Tim talked about? Or are we going to see the Kyoto Protocol wither away, become sort of an empty shell of an instrument with countries not having binding commitments in it, and go more towards the pledge and review framework, the bottom-up voluntary framework that some countries would prefer? We clearly need much greater ambition in this process. We're nowhere near to putting the pledges and the commitments and the actions on the table needed to fulfill the promise that political leaders made in Copenhagen 2 years ago of trying to keep temperature increases below 2 degrees Celsius, increase above pre-industrial levels. But we also need equity, and we need common but differentiated responsibility to be more than boilerplate words and to be actually reflected in the way this process goes forward. And it's very clear, because we had the experiment before Kyoto, that a voluntary bottom-up pledge and review structure won't work. If there was that failure of the original Rio Framework Treaty to get countries near to the voluntary goals they set in 1992 that led to the creation of the Kyoto Protocol. So we don't need to repeat that history. As we look at the playing field here, you see the European Union, the small island states, the least developed countries very clearly in favor of keeping Kyoto and building on it with a new instrument that would cover the major countries like the United States, China, others that don't have obligations under Kyoto. You see Japan and Russia wanting a new comprehensive legally binding agreement that includes all the major emitters, but wanting to pull out of Kyoto. And of course, we heard rumors just this morning that Canada may actually pull out of Kyoto just before Christmas in a couple of weeks. And my colleague Stephen Guilbeault is in the room here from Canada if you have specific questions on that. But clearly, Canada has already disrespected this process and the rest of the countries in the world by first not respecting its commitments that its parliament ratified for the first commitment period of Kyoto. Second, setting very weak targets for the year 2020. And third, this rumor that they may formally pull out of Kyoto. That's not what we need, a race to the bottom. We need a race of ambition to the top. Then you get to the major developing countries where it's a little more complicated. You see a willingness, I think, of most of them to acknowledge that long term they are going to need to take on greater responsibility as their development and their emissions increase. You see South Africa clearly stating its position, apart from the presidency, as a national delegation in favor of sort of a two-track approach, preserve Kyoto, and launch a roadmap towards a legally binding agreement. But less clarity from the other three members of BASIC, China, Brazil, and India, where they stand on this. And I think that's one of the key variables to look at in the next couple of weeks, where those countries go. You may have noticed that three of them, all but South Africa, put a conference room paper on the table just yesterday, stating that historical responsibility is an important principle and a basis for negotiations going forward. You could look at that as sort of putting a bargaining chip on the table for principles and in terms of reference for any new mandate or roadmap process launched out of here for the longer-term agreement. Then, of course, you come to my country, the United States, which says it wants to have a legally binding agreement, but has put preconditions on the table, such as legal symmetry, graduation of countries within the G77 to more responsibility, and no pre-linkage to technology and finance. These are all red line issues for the developing countries. The United States knows that well. These are non-starters if you truly want to come out of here with a negotiating process. The U.S. has also said it thinks we should have the science review and wait until 2015 to decide whether we need to take more action, and if so, what that action should be. We clearly need more action. As I said, we have a huge gap between the 2-degree target and the level of ambition that is put on the table. So we don't need to wait for the science review to tell us what we already know, that we all need to do more. So I think the real question here is can the European Union and others in the Kyoto process that want to stay in Kyoto and build on it reach an understanding with the key developing countries, the small island states, the LDCs, and others, that produces a successful outcome at the end of next week for preservation of the legally binding regime that we've created. I think if they can, that will put tremendous pressure on the U.S., on Japan, on Russia, and others to accept that mandate going forward and not wreck the train that we've been on. And the alternative is the coalition of the unwilling, as some have coined it, prevail. And you see it being very difficult for the European Union even to indicate it wants to stay in the KP. That would be the sort of worst-case outcome of this process, that indeed the Kyoto Protocol, as some have said, is murdered on African soil. So we don't want to see that. And finally, as Nima said, we need to see a progress on other issues, the issues that came out of Cancun, all very important: finance, technology, adaptation, reducing deforestation. But we need to see a clear process launched out of Durban over the next year that will have concrete steps proposed to close the ambition gap and get countries more on track to what leaders committed to 2 years ago in Copenhagen to stabilize the climate system by keeping below 2 degrees. So those are the stakes for this meeting. It's unpredictable, as we said, but it's all to play for.
Okay, I'll keep with this. So thanks very much. We have time for questions, and may I ask, we place priority on reporters or media outlets, and please announce yourself and what outlet you're coming from.
Thank you, Daniel Walker, the Motor Business Weekly. Can we hear a bit more about the possible Canadian pullout? Why was it announced now, and would this have an impact on Japan, Russia, and so on? Is this really very bad news, or can we get over it?
Well, as I said, this is sort of the third strike from Canada. The first was announcing they were not going to meet their targets that were committed to by the previous government in Canada. The second was putting very weak targets on the table, and the third is this rumored pullout. We think Canada has a choice to make here, and it ought to make its intentions clear. Either to disavow these rumors and say they're false and it does not intend to pull out of Kyoto and wants to be full partner in these negotiations in both tracks, the KP track and the LCA track, or it should man up and say, yes, the rumors are true, we do intend to pull out of Kyoto, and as an honorable country, we're not going to participate in the Kyoto negotiations and try to water down or weaken some of the targets and the loopholes and the other things in the KP track. We're going to stand aside for that. But it shouldn't have it both ways of saying we haven't decided yet whether we're going to pull out of Kyoto and actively participate in the KP track. So, I mean, but in the end of the day, I mean, obviously, Canada is important. It's important to have all countries in this process, but at the end of the day, other countries can go ahead and should go ahead without Canada if this rumor proves to be true. And if you want to talk about some of the domestic implications of this, as I said, my colleague Stephen Gabot is in the room and can talk to you later about that.
Thanks. In the middle here.
Hi, Stian Reckler with Thomson Reuters Point Carbon. At the EU press conference yesterday, the EU made it very clear that their main priority here in Durban is to create a Durban roadmap for a 2015 deal. While at the same time, all the developing countries have made it clear that they come here to sort of make sure that the Bali roadmap actually happens. I was just wondering if you could comment on the chances the EU has to convince the major developing countries to go along with creating a new roadmap before the old one is actually been finished.
Sure. The point here is really about finishing the Bali roadmap. When Bali was launched, they didn't quite get down to the detail of saying exactly what form the final outcome would take. They said it would be an agreed outcome. So really what the EU is talking about is getting to the end point of that, finalising what is that final end point. It should be a legally binding agreement, it should have legal commitments for a growing number of countries. So I think there's a way to reconcile these two tensions that you point to. We need an agreement which builds on the past, preserving Kyoto, which is the key demand of developing countries, plans for the future, giving the EU what they want, but does so in the context of completing the Bali roadmap rather than necessarily starting something afresh. What we need to be really careful of in this COP, though, is that while we build on the past and plan for the future, we also deliver here and now and present. And we've got to get the money flowing through the Green Climate Fund, finding the sources of that 100 billion commitment to make sure that while we're trying to create this long-term architecture, we don't leave poor people on the sidelines, and we make sure that they get the resources that they need in the next years.
In the front.
If you hear what Mr. Gore said, Tim Gore said, you'll understand that after a while you begin to come to the conclusion that the governments are not actually working on our behalf at all. They're actually probably in the hands of the multinationals. And as Tasneem has mentioned later, this country has already once, when it saw things were not going to go its way with the governments, decided to take another plan. If you have a look at the World Against Wall Street that's been happening on the financial levels, is there any plan that you know of, perhaps by Climate Action Network, to possibly take this out of the hands of the governments altogether and just do it? Just do the actions that we know need to be done, utilizing contributions from the companies that are not working against us.
Okay, so Climate Action Network and David, you should really be talking about what we are going to be doing in Durban itself. But I do think we need to acknowledge that this process is critical, but it's not the full picture, and that a lot of domestic actions need to happen. And we can't just write off the responsibilities of government at national levels to start implementing very urgent actions already. And we know in South Africa, you've heard the announcements, that they've already tried to implement actions that could achieve the target that they set in Copenhagen. So the process is one element that we need to look at and pressurize and keep the pressure for ambition, but certainly we all have a role to play in our national context to already urgently move towards acting to prevent this kind of catastrophic climate change we're talking about. So I think we all have a role to play.
Just to add on that, at the end of the day, the atmosphere doesn't care how many decisions are made at COPs or how many new processes are launched. The atmosphere cares about physical emissions of greenhouse gases. As Bill Clinton might have said, it's the emissions stupid that we have to be worrying about here. So the good news is, if you look outside this process, there are some positive trends that you can look at. UNEP just reported last week, for example, that investments in renewable energy for the first time surpassed those in new fossil fuel technology. There are things happening even in my country, which the United States, which appears benighted looking at it from this process, but if you look what's actually happening on the ground, almost 30 states in the U.S. have passed renewable electricity requirements that are driving investments in that technology, even though Washington is gridlocked between the parties. So there are hopeful signs, but the key point is that we're not moving anywhere near as fast as we need to meet what the science is telling us we have to do, and that's the challenge. Every process has a role to play. This process has a role to play in creating some certainty and trust, putting processes in place to transfer technology, help the most vulnerable countries, and total up what we're doing against the stated commitment. But most of the action has to happen at the national level, the state or provincial level, the city level, and the individual level. And certainly there are positive signs from some companies that they get this, they want to be part of the paradigm shift, but as you say, there's many that are trying to throw as many roadblocks in the way, not only this process, but of action at the national level as they can, the coal industry, many in the oil industry, etc. So we have to call them out and say, you've got a choice to make. Are you either part of the future, or are you part of the past?
Sorry, we're actually going to have to close here. I'm getting a wrap-up signal from the organizers. And just maybe one thing to add on this, and from the Climate Action Network's perspective, we're all here in Durban, a long way from home, because we feel that this process is incredibly important because it gives a voice to the most vulnerable countries in the process. If you go to other forums and other arenas, those voices are sometimes not heard. And so we want to make sure that we're supporting those that are most vulnerable to ensure that we can get an agreement and get the action that is absolutely necessary. Of course, if that action isn't going to be found here, we're going to be looking to make sure that it happens elsewhere, as Tasneem and Alvin have stated. But that's why we're here, is because we want to support those that are most vulnerable. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be here again tomorrow at 12:30, same time as today, and happy to answer any questions on the side as well.
I think it's fluid. I mean, there are conversations going on, as you understand, behind the scenes, but the public statements are not a meeting of the minds right now.